Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new Getting to Know Japan webinar. Thank you for joining us. I am Jenna Lindicke Heavenrich, a research fellow and the director of the Pacific Connect here at YCAPS. I am stepping in today for our usual host and program director of this series, Amani Kidd, who is behind the scenes today. Today we are joined by Mr. David Boling, who will be presenting on U.S.-Japan trade relations. David Boling is a principal at the Asia Group. As Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Japan during the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations, he worked on various trade negotiations with Japan. He began his career as a trial attorney at the U.S. Department of Justice, where he was a Mike Mansfield Fellow. He also served as Chief of Staff to a U.S. congressman and was Vice President of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation. So before we begin with his slides, just a kind reminder to everyone to refrain from turning on your microphone during the duration of today's presentation. So please take it away, David.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Terrific to be joining YCAPS. I frequently join and try to watch the different programming you do, and I think it's terrific. And so thank you for your contribution to the U.S.-Japan community for sure. So yeah, Amani, if you want to go ahead and put up my presentation, we can start to work through it. So yeah, we'll be talking about U.S.-Japan trade relations tonight. Hot topic, given that's going on in the trade world, as well as the fact that Prime Minister Takaichi will be meeting with President Trump today in the United States, and trade will certainly be one of the items. Next slide. This is just a quick overview of what I plan to talk about tonight. Basically, we're going to be talking about the history of U.S.-Japan trade relations from my perspective, and then also talking a bit about the summit itself, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Next slide. Just a brief word about the Asia Group. I'm relatively new to the firm. I joined in mid-January. I'm in Tokyo right now. We'll eventually be based here. But the Asia Group is, as it sets out here, a strategic advisory firm that helps corporations navigate different regulatory environments. As you can see, we have offices all over Asia. We've just recently, within the last week, opened an office in the Middle East as well. Our headquarters is in Washington, D.C., and that's by far our largest office. But you can see examples of some of the things that we do, which I think many of you are probably familiar with, market entry, market access issues, helping firms develop their own corporate strategies, for whatever market they may be working in, as well as geopolitical risk. We do have a new product that we've just started to roll out over the last couple of months called TAG. TAG is abbreviation for the Asia Group, where we're trying to harness the power of AI to give real-time geopolitical monitoring and analysis for our clients. And it is really stepping up our game and making us really sharpening our analysis, I should say. Next slide. So this is the beginning of, I started, my career with Japan really started in 1988 when I came on the JET program. And I expect there's many JET alums who are watching today. So I was very much affected by the trade tensions that were going on between the U.S. and Japan at the time. And so what this slide is highlighting, which I think many of you will know, but maybe a little bit of new information for some of the younger ones in our audience, is, when Japan during the post-war miracle was rising so rapidly, its economy was rising so quickly, it was becoming seen as a threat, basically, to the United States from the late 70s, I would say, through the 90s. And that was driven in large part by the trade deficit that the United States started to run with Japan, which I believe started in the mid or early 1970s, and the manufacturing jobs that were lost. because of the competition from Japan. And obviously, automobiles was the big and probably most noticeable industry where the United States felt threats, but they felt threats in many others. Semiconductors, um, also the concern about the currency exchange rate and that the dollar was way too strong, and that was making it difficult for U.S. exporters to compete, led to the Plaza Accord. But if you go back and look at the history, there were so many different products that were contentious between the United States and Japan. Many agriculture products, beef, oranges, of course, rice, still something of an issue, pork, and then other, manufactured products. I've already mentioned automobiles, already mentioned semiconductors. Supercomputers was a very hot topic at one point in the late 80s through the early 90s. And what I put here are three books that I read, and that came out, two of them came out in 1989. The Enigma of Japanese Power by Carl van Wolferen. And then I'm a little bit blocked on seeing the other one right now. Oh, yes, Trading Places by Clyde Prestowitz, which was dealing with the semiconductor issue. James Fallow's this third book. This book came out a little bit later in the mid 1990s, 1994, I believe. James Fallows was writing for the Atlantic Monthly, as I remember at the time, and he was writing a lot about Japan. And the basic feeling was is that the policy that the U.S. had in place to deal with Japan just wasn't working. And there had to be a new way of thinking about how to deal with the problem. And that's what it was called at the time, the problem of Japan. And these three authors were influential at the time. They were particularly influential, in my view, with the way the Clinton administration approached Japan in the early 90s, of basically arguing for a reset in how we deal with Japan, that in some ways we needed to become more like Japan and promote industrial policy. I mean, we've seen that come back in vogue with the Trump administration and even with the Biden administration. But at
You
the time, it was a
know,
big debate because of the free market and that there was such strong views about free trade. But these were three key books at the time that reset the view of Japan and influenced policy. Monty, why don't we go to the next slide? So the previous slide, I had characterized the time as adversarial, right? That the U.S. and Japan were really, yeah, quite adversarial in the trade negotiations. We always had the defense and the security allowance to, pardon me, security alliance to balance that tension. But it was a very intense period of time. I think after the 90s, and then when you got into the George W. Bush administration, there was a different view of how to deal with Japan. And I'll be honest, some of it was probably just exhaustion on the part of the United States, that they had tried so many different ways to open up the Japanese market, to reduce the trade deficit, that and the feeling that most of it had not been successful, and that the political tension and the temperature had gotten so high at certain times, particularly during the Clinton administration. There were threats of automobile tariffs, that we needed to turn down the temperature. And so it moved into what I call more of a management phase. And I think it started at the end of the Clinton administration under the framework talks, but then during the Bush administration, it really became the centerpiece of the approach to Japan. And it was more what were called at the time regulatory reform initiatives. And these were, and I participated in a kind of an early version of those from 1997 to 1999 during the Clinton administration, but it continued on. But highly technical discussions, really focused on specific issues that were problematic for U.S. exporters in the Japanese market, particular regulations and standards that the United States wanted to see addressed. It could be in telecom, pharmaceutical, competition policy, all sorts of areas. So just a very broad discussion. And every year they would produce a report. And those reports would become extraordinarily long. I mean, dozens of pages and very technical. If you go on the internet and do a search, you can probably pull up some of the old reports. And it was good work, but it was grinding work, is how I would describe it. And the Japanese were not that enthusiastic about it, but felt like they had to be showing something to the United States that they were willing to engage. But my experience from 1997 to 1999, when I worked on those issues, is that yeah, the talks could frequently be the two sides sort of talking across each other, not really engaging. But nevertheless, it was a way to manage the relationship, a way for the administration, the Bush administration in particular, to show to corporate America, which was still very concerned about Japan, that we are engaging, and this is a channel, a means where we can raise your issues. And the Japanese would raise their issues with the United States as well, our anti-dumping laws, the fact that we still had not adopted the metric system. And I'm not joking, that was something that they frequently would raise in our negotiations. Other issues like the Jones Act. So it became something of a two-way. Two-way is probably too strong of a word. I would say that most of the complaints were on the U.S. side, 75, 80%. But there would be an opportunity for the Japanese to raise issues about the U.S. market. And then we moved into TPP, and this was, and I was involved in TPP negotiations at the end of the Obama administration. But initially Japan was reluctant to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations because it was so protective of agriculture. Japan had been so passive for years on trade because it always wanted to protect the agriculture market. It was really, I mean, that was really the driving approach to trade for Japan, was we have to protect agriculture, so we really don't want to engage or talk. That shifted under Abe, and Abe decided, no, Japan needs to be more forward leaning, and we will join. And so Japan joined, as I recall, in 2013. Again, I came in at the very end of the Obama administration in 2015 and worked on the TPP negotiations with Japan. And what was striking about that is, TPP involved many countries across the Asia Pacific. And on certain issues, the US and Japan were actually quite cooperative. And that's where you started to see more cooperation begin, which leads to the next phase I'll talk about in a minute. But on issues like intellectual property, uh, you saw the United States and Japan negotiating with other TPP countries like Vietnam and Malaysia, where the US and Japan were very much aligned in their view of what would be a good intellectual property regime in those countries. And the US and Japan would work together to urge, Vietnam or Malaysia, other countries to sort of step up their standards to try to reach the TPP standards. So you had on some issues, the US and Japan were very much aligned. They're both mature markets, open countries, democracies. Our values were in sync. But on other issues, it was still contentious, like automobiles, like rice. And you had that negotiation going on at the same time. So for me, it was very interesting to go from one negotiation to the other. I was very much involved in the autos and agriculture negotiations, very contentious. And then I would go in a room and they'd be talking about intellectual property. And the Japanese and the US are just like, all chummy and getting along very well. So that was an interesting dynamic to watch unfold. But again, Japan still had high sensitivity on agriculture, as one of these bullet points points out: rice, wheat, beef, pork, dairy, sugar, all that stuff, really sensitive for the Japanese. And so you saw, issues that in the 1970s and 1980s that were big between the U.S. and Japan. They were still lingering into the 2010s. So let's move to the next slide. And this is a phase that I have called the Allies phase. And I've kind of gone back and forth on whether this is a really good way to describe it, but it's the best way I could describe it for now. And that's where you saw the US and Japan, and as I mentioned in TPP, more cooperation, but the rise of China as an economic threat and the feeling that, Japan and the US were having to deal with the same problems with China. That China was now, not Japan, 70s and 80s. Japan was the problem. China was now the problem, and that it was disrupting global trade through excess capacity in steel, in solar panels. Now we have it in electric vehicles. That there was the problem of theft of intellectual property in China that hurt US companies, but also hurt Japanese companies. The problem of forced technology transfers enforced by the government, the Chinese government, that were hurting Japanese firms and hurting US companies. And so you saw a kind of convergence that, hey, we really need to be working together as much as we can to deal with the China problem. And uh, so that brought the US and Japan closer together. Then, of course, the United States pulled out of TPP, and Japan was very, very disappointed by that. Japan picked up the mantle, moved forward, renamed it CPTPP, and was able to get it through. And, Abe, Prime Minister Abe really gets the credit. But not only that, Japan signed a deal with the Europeans, a big free trade agreement, I think in 2019. Also went forward with the Regional Comprehensive Economic uh, uh, Partnership, RCEP, that involved China, South Korea, other countries. So Japan became much more proactive and much more enthusiastic about free trade and trade agreements compared to the United States. In the United States, when the Trump administration came in, but it was already starting, I would argue, in the Obama administration, uh, and to take a very different view of trade and be much more trade skeptical, much more focused on trade deficits, much more focused on protecting manufacturing. Those kind of issues became huge. So you had during the Trump administration, first Trump administration, they pulled out of TPP, and so they needed to regain some leverage because there was still a desire to open up the Japanese market on agriculture. The problem had been with the U.S. pulled out of TPP, Canada and Australia were still members of TPP. They were going to get lower tariffs for their agriculture exports to Japan, and that was going to hurt U.S. farmers because they would be still paying the higher tariff rates. So the Trump administration negotiated this U.S.-Japan trade agreement, and the deal was Japan, or it was really more Abe and Trump. I mean, I don't think this thing would have happened without Abe, but Trump convinced Abe through, how should I say this? Well, he made it clear. Look, if you don't want tariffs on automobiles coming in from Japan, we need to have market access to Japan's agriculture market. And we wanted it about TPP levels. So the deal that was struck was the Trump administration would not raise tariffs on automobile imports from Japan in exchange for market access to the agriculture market. And so that was the deal. And there was also a digital trade agreement that was signed. So, once we got past that, I would say things were pretty smooth between Japan and the United States. And that was a relatively quick negotiation. I mean, none of these negotiations are easy. I can tell you that. And the Japanese are very tough negotiators because they're extraordinarily well prepared. Happy to talk about that in the question and answer. So no trade deal is easy to negotiate, but once we got past that, I would say that the trade issues really simmered down. Then you had the Biden administration come in with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, and there was a lot of cooperation between the U.S. and Japan, again, on China-related issues, supply chain cooperation. So I think that that carried us through to the current Trump administration. I think that's probably about, I won't go into all the details on the right side. I think that it shows some of the concessions that Japan made on beef, rice, wine, other things, what Japan got on autos and auto parts, and then the U.S. digital trade agreement. So why don't we go to the next slide? And I think we'll be close to wrapping up and ready to take a question. So next slide, Amani. There we go. So yes, so now we're into the second Trump administration, and the first I've been asked frequently, what's the difference between the first Trump administration and the second Trump administration when it comes to trade, and others have said this, and I think this is a good way to sum it up, is that the second Trump administration is the first Trump administration, except on steroids when it comes to trade policy, because he came out swinging with tariffs. And I would say one difference in my mind is sort of the justification for tariffs. In the first Trump administration, there was not a whole lot of discussion about using tariffs to raise revenue, to making it a significant revenue source. I mean, tariffs have not been a significant source of revenue for the United States for decades. And I think you have to go back into the 1800s really to see that time when tariff revenue was significant. I mean, really after the federal income tax was introduced, tariff dropped dramatically. But the Trump administration had a different view. And so not only are tariffs being used, to favor U.S. domestic industry, manufacturing, to try to deal with trade deficits, but this administration has made tariffs and argued we need tariffs to raise revenue. And that's a big shift. I mean, that is a huge shift in tariff policy, just that. So I do think that is probably, I guess, an example of how the Trump administration really started to ramp it up. So let's see. Looks like we kind of went, yeah, all right. So I see where we are now. But this is kind of walking through the relationship between Trump and or in the second Trump administration, the approach on trade with Japan. And yeah, you can see that I mean, he started off with his relationship with Ishiba, but then there was the threat of the reciprocal tariffs, the across-the-board tariffs. And then this led to the investment agreement between the U.S. and Japan. And that's really now the centerpiece of U.S.-Japan trade relations and will be for the duration of the Trump administration. And this is a remarkable agreement. The Japanese have agreed basically to invest $550 billion in the United States by the end of the Trump administration. The background on this is, the Japanese did not want to open their market anymore. If they changed their tariffs, they had to go. This is last summer. The key red line for them is they did not want to change any Japanese tariffs for imports from the United States, because if they did, that would require them to go to the Diet to change the law. And that would have been difficult last summer because the LDP and the coalition partner Komeito did not have a majority in the Diet. So that they wanted to avoid that at all costs. So no new market access. So they wanted to lean heavily on investment because Japan is the top foreign direct investor in the United States, has been for the last 6 years. They felt like they were aligned with the Trump administration on this issue because the Trump administration wants Japan to be investing in sectors like semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, energy, shipbuilding, AI, quantum computing, and the Japanese want to invest in those industries anyway. So that's the centerpiece now for the relationship. And when Takaichi met with Trump in October last year, they issued a fact sheet that set out a number of projects, AI related, energy related, where US and Japanese companies expressed interest in investing in sectors like that, and I put a dollar figure on it, and it totaled about $400 billion if I recall correctly. But the point was, this could be up to that amount. But that was the first rollout, and then we had the first uh, first round of investments were rolled out last month, as I recall, that set out Japanese investments in, and I think it's in the next slide actually, where there will be investments. Why don't we go ahead and go to the next slide, Amani? Yeah, here on the right, the gas-fired project for AI data centers in Ohio, and then the crude oil export infrastructure facility in Texas, as well as the synthetic diamond plant. That was the first round. I think one of the things we'll be watching for this summit, if there's any more, if there are any other investments. There have been investments that have been under negotiation. This left column mentions some of them: nuclear reactors, copper refining, these displays, as well as battery storage uh, and discussions. So we'll see here, in a few hours whether anything pops out. The Obviously, the Supreme Court decision that struck down the statute, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, had a big effect. Trump had been using that. He could really, threaten tariffs at the drop of a hat using that law. It's not a trade law, it's really a sanctions law, but he had stretched the interpretation of it to include tariffs. And, I was surprised. I thought he would probably prevail at the Supreme Court, but he did not. And they struck that down as a basis. So that's now shifting Trump's strategy on tariffs. He's still tariff man. I mean, he calls himself tariff man for a reason, and he's got extraordinarily strong feelings about trade and tariffs. So he's having to shift his focus back to what I would call traditional trade tools. Section 301, we saw two investigations open that included Japan last week. And then he's also stretching the boundaries again and using Section 122 as a basis to put back in the across the board tariff. But the main point here, I would say, is that Japan has been pretty cool, pretty level-headed through this process. They indicated, after the Supreme Court opinion came out, that they had no plans to change their approach on investment. I think that was wise. And as I said, this investment agreement will really be the centerpiece of U.S.-Japan trade relations. And the important thing to remember, this investment agreement is not what I'd call traditional trade. When I look at the investment agreement between the U.S. and Japan, this $550 billion deal, as a former trade negotiator, it is not a kind of document I was used to seeing. It strikes me more as like a Wall Street investment deal. When I look at, for example, the agreement between U.S. and Malaysia, that looks more like a traditional trade agreement from my viewpoint. But that's where we are in the U.S.-Japan trade relationship now, where the investment is really the centerpiece and will be for the rest of the Trump administration. So I think I'm going to stop there because I've gone about 30 minutes, and we wanted to be sure to leave 30 minutes for questions. So ask me tough questions.
Well, thank you very much, David, for that deep um, presentation on a quite lengthy period of time. Um, I think one of the questions that first came to my mind was, given this investment deal, how does the Japanese government facilitate private investment in the US? Like how is it the Japanese government able to say we commit to this level of investment even though it's a private sector doing the investing?
Yeah, very good question. And yeah, ultimately, this does come down to the private sector, but there are a couple of entities that are involved in this: the Japan Bank of International Cooperation, NEXI, Nippon Export. I forget the Nippon Export. Maybe you can help me. You can check on that, Jenna, online. what that abbreviation stands for, but it's basically providing insurance. But those two entities are going to play a very important role in this and are playing. And I would say JBIC, in my mind, really is playing an important role by providing the loans and loan guarantees that will help Japanese firms to be able to participate in these big projects. But ultimately, it is the Japanese private sector that's got to see these investments as attractive. And I do think it's important, again, to emphasize that the Japanese, my sense, is the Japanese in general, corporate Japan still has a very, very strong appetite for investing in the United States. And I don't see that changing in the next 5 years, that will continue, that it makes sense from a business standpoint. I mean, the United States is still I mean, it's a very, in many ways, it's a very strong investment. It's less risky than a lot of places. When you think about the country itself, it is a growing market. It makes sense geopolitically for Japan because Japan increasingly wants to be investing and doing business with like-minded countries. And of course, that gets to China and the ongoing concern about China. And the United States is Japan's most important ally for certain. And so there's a lot of reasons why the Japanese private sector would want to invest in the United States anyway. And as I mentioned in my presentation, the sectors that the Japanese are interested in, because they're keenly interested in economic security. If anything, the Middle East has heightened that concern about security, energy security as well. That they want to be investing in these industries that are related to economic security, like semiconductors, like critical minerals, AI, quantum computing, all of that. So I think, well, the interesting thing to think about, and I don't have an answer for it, is how much of this investment would have been coming to the United States anyway. And I think a fair amount of it would have. But also, I do think that now part of the reason Japanese firms are probably eager to invest in the United States is also to maintain good relations with the United States so that tariff man does not whack them and to maintain their market access in the United States. So that does introduce more what I would call a political consideration, which I think is now probably a bit bigger now for the Japanese. And were you able to find Nexi?
Yes, Nexi was Nippon
Nippon
Export
Export.
and Investment
Yes.
Insurance.
Yes. Thank you very much.
And you also mentioned JBIC, which is the Japan Bank
Yeah.
of International Cooperation.
Right. JBIC. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. So one of our questions from the audience, talking a little bit about Japan's response here, from Shin Shoji. The question was, with the public comment period approaching on April 15th on Section 301, do you see Japan's seemingly muted response publicly on the double Section 301 investigation as normal?
Good question. So just to explain a little bit more about the Section 301 and investigations that have been open, that one was open Thursday last week and then another on Friday. The one that was open on Thursday is in essence about excess capacity and I should say economic excess capacity. And it lists 16 countries. And they are not listed in alphabetical order, and that's important. And Japan is 15th of 16th. I flag that because the bad news for Japan is it's listed. Yeah, it's on the list. The good news is I don't think it's the main focus. When you talk about excess capacity, as I had mentioned earlier, the poster child for that is China. And China is the first country listed in that Section 301 complaint. The other complaint lists 60 countries in alphabetical order, and it's about forced labor. And it's not that Japan, and Japan is listed there, it's not that Japan is engaging in forced labor. The issue is the United States has very tough laws about importing products that have been produced by forced labor and has enforced the law that was passed a few years ago quite strictly. Other countries have not done that. And there is a view, a very strong view, I think, bipartisan view in Washington, D.C., that that's not fair to the United States if other countries are allowing uh, products made with forced labor to come into their country and that those are competing, potentially against U.S. products. That's not right. And so I think that's the main thrust of that. And so the issue for Japan would be what kind of legislation, what kind of measures it's taken to ensure that that is not happening in Japan. My guess is that Japan probably has a pretty good track record there. I don't know it well. And so for both of these complaints, they'll have a process they have to go through. It was mentioned the notice and comment period and all that. I don't think the Japanese government's that worked up over these petitions because they don't feel like they're really the main target. Section 301, and I'll wrap up here to go back to my presentation about the 70s and 80s, or I should say really 1980s and 90s. Section 301 was used against the Japanese. And if you talk to any senior government Japanese official or recently retired government official, they know those numbers. 301 are sort of etched in their memory. And it's not a good memory because it was used in automobiles. As I recall, it was used in semiconductors, maybe supercomputers. And there was even this Super 301 that was used to identify countries to put them on a list. And Japan was on that list, 1989, then maybe in 1990, but that's when the legislation was enforced. But 301 is well known in Japan. So I think this is a little bit of deja vu all over again for Japanese trade folks because they're very familiar with this. But as I said, the good news here is that I do not think Japan is really the main target here. They're on the petitions. I don't think that Prime Minister Takaichi is going to make a big deal out of this with Trump. I expect she will raise it, but that the process has to, I mean, they have 301 has a process and it will take some time before a decision is made. I would expect by July when the Section 122 tariffs expire is the target date. But yeah, that's how I assess those 301 petitions against Japan.
Right. So before we move on to the next question, could I ask a little clarification as I'm not a trade person? What do
Hmm.
you mean by excess capacity? What is the concern there?
Yeah, so the concern is this, and I'll just use the example of China because it's easy. Excess capacity means producing, and I'm not an economist. I'll give you sort of my view as a lawyer, producing much more than the market needs. And China has this is part of their economic model. Would be the argument that China does not have much domestic demand for many products, and doesn't seem to want to encourage it as a policy. And so, what China has done and steel would be the case that's most clear to me, but I think others would say solar panels and now in electric vehicles is they receive the companies receive tremendous support from the government, subsidies, and they produce much more than can be consumed in China. And so then they export all that out to the world. And what they export is really cheap steel. And that goes into those countries and then decimates the steel industry in those countries, or the solar panel industry, or the electric vehicles. And so they're competing and they're sort of like flooding the market with these products and unwilling to adjust their economic model to complaints. And many countries have complaints about China flooding the world market with various products. And so that's what I'm getting at with excess capacity. And I think that's what the complaint is really aimed at. And China is, as I said, the poster child for that. And it's been extraordinarily difficult. And I would say so far, countries have been unsuccessful in convincing China to change its economic model and go away and move away from.
Great. Thank you so much for that clarification.
Sure. I'm glad you
So
asked the question. Thank you.
going back a little bit, you mentioned the sort of adversarial period in, was it the 80s and 90s?
Yes, yes.
Um, so Patricia Yarrow wanted to know, why was the US feeling so adversarial to Japan at that time?
Well, I would say that uh, that the U.S. felt like Japan was a threat, an economic threat, and that it was somewhat similar to China these days, uh, playing unfair when it came to trade, dumping, and that is the argument of how you deal when you're selling products below a fair market value, referred to as dumping. That is a product of excess capacity, dumping products. There was a feeling that Japan was dumping a lot of products in the United States at unfairly low prices. Economists will tell you, well, that benefits consumers because they get to buy cheaper products, but it becomes politically unsustainable when you have manufacturing sectors uh, in the Midwest suffering from that. And we saw that. I mean, I think that's really the big reason Trump was able to win in 2016 was this feeling that China had, I mean, to shift back to China, that China was playing unfairly and had decimated many manufacturing towns across the United States. There was a similar feeling about Japan, particularly in automobiles. Even though those automobiles benefited consumers, they led to a lot of unemployment, and it made the a lot of competition, which many politicians and many firms felt like was unfair competition from Japan. So it was very much seen as an economic threat. And I can remember it because that's when I was really sort of starting my career. Tremendous anxiety in the United States, and other examples where Japan, because the yen was so strong at the time, Japan was buying a lot of real estate in the United States, the Rockefeller Center in New York, Pebble Beach Golf Course in California. I mean, really, very well-known, sort of iconic pieces of property. And this was creating a sense of anxiety among many Americans that, what's going on? This is not right. Our country's not on the right track when it comes to the economy, and this is not fair, and we need to reorient it. And in Japan, yes, it was very much seen that way. Then Japan entered the 90s, and then the so-called lost decades started. But at the time, I would say, and I was in Japan from 91 to 93 when the economic bubble burst. I didn't feel like it was bursting at the time. In retrospect, you could see it. But there was still a lot of anxiety in the United States about Japan, I'd say through the mid 90s. I would add, just as I pointed out, is the one thing that was the balance against that was that Japan was an ally, right? And the U.S. Japan Security Alliance, pardon me, helped to balance that out. Whereas you don't have that with China. And so you have not only the feeling that China is an economic threat, but also given its activity in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, towards Taiwan and Hong Kong, that China is also a military threat.
Thank you for that deeper explanation. We have another question here from Tom Whitson, which is, do Trump's tariff policies live on after him, or do trading partners try to develop other less coercive partnerships after his terms? What do you suspect will happen?
Look, I think Trump is unique in many ways. I think we all know that. But to keep it focused on tariff, I don't think you're ever going to have another president in our lifetime who is going to say, I am tariff man. The tariffs are that important to me. Also, I think for Trump, trade policy is equal to foreign policy. And we all know, or I'll share this story, I've heard it many times, that frequently when Trump engages with foreign leaders, one of the first questions he'll ask his staff is, do we have a trade deficit with this country? I mean, he thinks about this stuff all the time. He's been thinking about trade policy since the 70s and 80s. And and he had very, very strongly negative views about Japan during that time. So for Trump, trade policy is a top issue. For most presidents, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, all of them, policy might be important, but it's a subset of economic policy. But for Trump, I think it's above that. And it is equal to foreign policy and how he looks at the world. I don't think you're going to have a president like that again, but I do think he has shifted trade policy in a dramatic way where I frequently feel like Trump, if you really look at Trump's trade policy, he's more like a protectionist Democrat, right? The way he talks about trade, he has more in common with Bernie Sanders than certainly free trade Republicans. And he was the only candidate in 2016 and among Republicans who first started running for the presidency. There were 16, 17 candidates. He was the only one who was against TPP. He was the only one who was criticizing NAFTA. The Republican Party was a party of free trade. He has really reshaped that and made it a party that's much more skeptical about trade, and in my view, made it much more like the left wing of the Democratic Party, the protectionist wing of the Democratic Party. So now you have the Democratic Party, which was always a bit more trade skeptical. The labor unions are influential on trade. And now you have a Republican Party that used to be free trade and is now, for the time being, much more trade skeptical. And I think in general, the mood in the United States is just much more questioning of free trade than it was 10 years ago. I think that has shifted. And I think whoever comes after Trump, whether it's a Democrat or Republican, is not going to be a free trade person. There's just not many politicians these days in Washington, D.C., who are walking around talking about, well, free trade's where we need to go. You just don't hear that like you used to. And so that has shifted. And I think that that is going to influence where trade policy goes. I think we've experienced a generational change, and Trump was the real catalyst. And I think it's affected other countries. And I think a lot of this goes back to China and this feeling that we weren't able to deal with China in the WTO, the World Trade Organization. We've tried all these dialogues with China, and none of them were particularly successful. And China will not change its economic model. And so as a consequence, we have to change the way we approach. And an agenda of free trade is not going to deal with the China problem. So I think that is fundamentally shifted, and I think other countries, Europe, other big economies recognize this. So I think we're moving into more of a period of what I would call global trade skepticism.
That's a really interesting shift that's happened from really the policies of one charismatic U.S. leader. Um, so as we're getting near the end of our time, I wanted to close with one question about this Takeuchi Trump summit that's happening in DC. What do you expect to come out of this visit with respect to trade? What do you think are going to be the focus points for their discussion in the area of trade?
Yeah, I think trade, obviously, because of the Iran war, trade in some ways is, been pushed down on the agenda, right? That all the focus from the press is going to be on, okay, what's Japan going to do, if anything, to work with the United States on the Iranian war? Where will it send warships there? What will it do as far as support? And Trump initially was pressing allies for that, and he backed off. So we'll see. That's going to get all the attention. But I think what the trade agenda, what Takaichi is going to want to do with the trade agenda is to say this. Look, we've made a commitment of $550 billion of investment over the course of your presidency, and we're stepping up. We've already had round one. We're working on round two. There'll be other rounds, and we're a good guy here. And we ought not to be treated any worse for sure than any other trade partner. Look what we're doing. I mean, really, I mean, frankly, and she's got a good case. I don't think there's any other country in the world that can do what Japan is doing and make the kind of commitment that it did. I mean, and execute it on these investments. So she has a very good argument. And, President Trump really likes investments. I mean, I think he sees that as a key part of his presidency is to, attract more investment into the United States. And so I think that's music to his ears. And she's going to want to emphasize that in part also because it's a good message in the case that Japan has restrictions, legal, political restrictions on how it can contribute to the efforts related to the war in Iran. That she may say, "Look, we got some limits here, but look what we're doing over here on the economic side. We're doing this, and we're really stepping up." So I think that will be the kind of approach she takes. So I expect some potentially some new announcements, and also others announcements related to things like critical minerals and these kinds of things.
Well, great. Thank you. So, I think we're going to wrap up the question section here. Thank you, everyone, for your wonderful questions. And thank you very much, David, for fielding all of our range of curiosities.
FadTech's IT support and mobile internet service helps make events like this one possible. Thank you.